This is episode 448 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. A lot of important news going on, and most of it's not getting any coverage. With the death of Kobe Bryant, the Grammys, the impeachment circus going on, the Super Bowl coming up, it seems like most of the TV has enough bread and circus to kind of fill their airwaves with, and we're not getting very much coverage of things like a U.S. plane going down in Afghanistan, protest and killing of protesters, and U.S. embassies being hit in Iraq, and Trump announcing his deal of the century, which I guess his intent behind it is to bring some kind of resolution to the Israeli occupation of Palestine. All that and more stories on today's show. Make sure you share it over at the Libertarian Institute. That's where you can find all my work. I write the daily news roundup, and that, along with the show, is featured on the homepage. If you're a new listener to the show, subscribe to it, give it a rating and a review wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you could be one of those great people that help keep this show going, go on over to patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, so first up on today's show, I have Poland now signing a deal with the U.S. to purchase, I believe, 20 F-35s at the total price of $4.6 billion. Occasionally when these deals happen, some politician or Donald Trump will take a victory lap and say, I create all these new great high-paying American jobs by selling Poland these F-35s. You know, he certainly lined the pockets of a lot of people who run these companies like Lockheed Martin, and I'm sure the executives at the companies that Lockheed contracts with to build the F-35. But overall, the project has been a huge drain on the American economy. It's taken at least, actually $1 trillion, and probably a whole lot more when you kind of look at consequences down the road and unattended, the invisible hand situation that we have in the economy, from productive uses, and put it into this F-35. And maybe occasionally you can make an argument, well, defensive weapons, security, that's some kind of value. Well, the F-35 doesn't really seem to provide any value because it doesn't work all that well. So this isn't something that's beneficial to the economy, and isn't something to be celebrated at all. Just more weapons. Daniel Larison wrote a piece at TAC, and he writes there all the time, and people should definitely just check out his work at the American Conservative. If you don't read the whole page every day, most of what they have over there is pretty good. But this one I think is important just because it's a reminder that the U.S. has 1 year to renew the New START treaty with Russia. This is the big arms control agreement that the U.S. and Russia have left between them. So it's essential that at the very least this gets extended. Russia has put out, and it seems at least the way negotiations have worked over the past few years as I've observed them, there's probably not enough time now to get some kind of deal done to actually replace New START and maybe advance it. But at the very least, we could extend this so maybe a president who isn't as poor of a negotiator as Donald Trump could make some kind of deal with Russia where we actually reduce the number of nuclear weapons. So I'll have that one linked in the show notes page. Some news on Julian Assange. He's actually been moved out of solitary confinement, so this is something of a victory. Now, he's still being held in a maximum security prison, which, isn't where this man belongs, which in a newsroom somewhere, working to expose the truth. But at the very least, this is a guy who, worst crime he was convicted of, at least in the UK, but I believe ever, was skipping bail on bogus charges that were later dropped. So he did the absolute maximum sentence for that crime, but now they're still holding him there at the maximum security prison and up until this point in solitary confinement because the Americans want to extradite him to the U.S. For being a journalist. And so for months and months, he's been out of the Ecuadorian embassy for several months now. His lawyers have been, going to the public, the UN Special Rapporteur for Torture, many Julian Assange's supporters within the media, doctors, have all put out fairly powerful statements saying that, hey, the condition of this guy is concerning, and you're going to kill him if you leave him in this prison for this long. He needs serious medical treatment. Leave aside, all the injustice that goes along with the fact that he's just a journalist and shouldn't be held. So, yeah, a little bit good news that he's out of solitary confinement. According to Caitlin Johnstone, she had a pretty good write-up on this. She said that it was actually inmates at the prison who were starting to file petitions and explain how wrong this was, that was in part the catalyst for getting this change made. At the same time, if the UK has to hold him in some kind of minimum security facility, he's in pretty poor health. I doubt he's going to be making any daring escapes. And, the UK could just really take a stand here for the First Amendment and decide, screw the United States. Julian Assange is a journalist. He worked with one of our very prominent newspapers, The Guardian, to put out the leads provided to him by Chelsea Manning that the U.S. is trying to charge him with the Espionage Act for. So on that, fact alone, the UK should oppose this, because it seems like it would maybe open some of their newsmen and journalists open to being extradited by the U.S., since Julian Assange isn't an American citizen either. All right, so I want to talk you about this plane crash in Afghanistan. And one of the things I'll say is, it doesn't seem like we have a whole lot of details yet, which is interesting. Plane crashes are usually something that gets a whole lot of attention in the media. Now, this is a little bit less true when it's a military aircraft, especially if everybody lives. Because sometimes, the plane crashes, but the pilots eject, especially from these fighter planes. About this particular one, it seems that up to 5 Americans were killed. But again, there's really been no coverage of it, so not many details coming out. A couple of unnamed sources have put the American line forward, which is, and I think this is more the official narrative than lead, so it's possible that not all of this is correct, but the plane went down. The Taliban claim responsibility, but the Americans say that untrue. I've seen reports that 4 people were killed and 2 people were captured. The Americans say that less than 5 people died. The Afghan army worked to try to get to the site and was repelled by the Taliban. I believe this is in the Ghazni province. But as I imagined, the U.S. has apparently been able to get in there and recover the remains. So see what happens here, especially because of some of the rumors behind this story, that if the Taliban shot down this plane, that seems significant. There may have been somebody on the plane who was involved in the targeting of Soleimani. There's always these lies coming out of the U.S. government that, the Taliban are allied with Iran, and that's why we have to also oppose Iran. And that's, part of their claims of Iranian malign influence in the area. And generally, this has been untrue, if not entirely and always completely. I mean, maybe the Iranians from time to time, the Taliban do control a chunk of territory along the Iranian border, have taken not the most hostile positions with the Taliban, but they're certainly not what the American government is to the Afghan government. This is a story that I'm sure I will be talking about in the days to come as we find out who was on the plane and how it went down. Elsewhere in Afghanistan, an Afghan government airstrike killed at least 7 civilians. They were all from the same family. And then the UN is looking for donations to provide basic aid, that's food and health aid, medical aid, to 9.4 million Afghanis. This is a increase of 3 million over last year. And, something just about the Afghan war that I think is reflected here, that it's getting a lot worse there. The U.S. is carrying out a lot more airstrikes. In the few weeks following the breakdown of talks between the U.S. and the Taliban in September, you had then Mike Pompeo coming out and saying the U.S. had killed thousands of Taliban in the weeks to come. So imagine all those airstrikes being dropped. A lot of civilians being killed. Record number. The U.S. killing more civilians than the Taliban. And again, just kind of like what I was talking about in the start of the show, there's no time to cover this. Even with the Pentagon Papers coming out in December, there really hasn't been a major discussion anywhere about continuing this war and why it needs to stop, and that it's not just at this point a choice between leaving and letting the Afghan government and the Taliban fight over it, or staying and things staying the same. If we stay, things are falling apart and the conditions are getting worse for the Afghan people. Some news on Iran. The foreign minister put out a tweet saying that his country was open to negotiations. This statement from Iran comes with, if the U.S. drops sanctions, they're willing to negotiate. They're willing to return to the 2015 Non-Proliferation Treaty Safeguards Agreement, the JCPOA. So essentially, what you had with Iran was them being within an agreement that said that they weren't going to make nuclear weapons, and the international watchdog group that's assigned to monitor nuclear weapons and nuclear energy programs has verified time and time again that Iran is not making a nuclear weapon, and the strongest conclusion that they ever reached was that Iran may have at one point done just some basic testing around, the feasibility and what it would take to attain a nuclear weapon, but actually never moved in the direction of building a weapon. So that Donald Trump could return to that situation, tomorrow, and drop the sanctions, return to the 2015 JCPOA, and then Iran says they'll talk about other things, but they're not going to communicate till then. Now, Trump's response to this is no thanks, which is disappointing. You think he would, in an election year, want to have some kind of success, and even if it's just returning back to the JCPOA and reducing tensions with Iran. A lot of Americans are scared of what's going to happen, a possibility of war with Iran. So alleviating that fear, even if it was one that Trump created himself, may be a little bit of a victory in the eyes of the American people. We have an Iranian satellite launch coming up, and this is something I talk about almost, every 4 or 5 months when Iran launches either test or launches a satellite into space. The Hawks go crazy. Oh, this is dual use. They're trying to test ballistic missiles, but in space, and that way they could then build ICBM and hit the U.S. with a nuclear weapon. Now, of course, Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon, isn't trying to build a nuclear weapon, and no country has ever turned a space program into an ICBM program. In fact, the only country to ever develop an ICBM program after developing a space program was North Korea, and the designs of the two rockets are completely different because they really don't overlap. It's like some of the things with the dual use technology with the nuclear program. There's different devices and things that could be used to make a nuclear weapon, but are also essential for, let's say, using nuclear reactors to produce energy or medicine. And every time Iran has been verified to only be using it for civilian purposes, here again, there's no reason to believe Iran is doing anything but trying to improve the technology and the wealth of their country by putting satellites into space. Some news on Syria. General Kenneth McKenzie tells U.S. forces in Syria that they're going to be there for a while. A chunk of U.S. forces in Syria, 600 or so, are there to occupy oil fields, and there's been a couple run-ins with, I don't know if they're Russian mercenaries or actual Russian forces in the past couple weeks, where, they're driving down a road to get to an oil field and the Americans show up there and block the road in front of them. So far, it seems like these games are all pretty civil for two armies that are on opposite sides of the war, could possibly be here. My guess is that Russia kind of assumes that eventually the Americans will have to leave, and when that happens, then they'll take the oil fields, but it's not worth the fight before. There's also some Americans in southern Syria, just on the opposite side of the border of Jordan, and they control a good-sized pocket into Syria, about 150 U.S. troops backing some rebel fighters there. On different occasions, Assad's forces have tried to move into the area and have been targeted with fire from the American base. There is an ongoing fight in Idlib. This is a region of Syria that borders Turkey, kind of northern Syria, and it's the last major pocket of these Syrian rebel forces. For several years, as the Assad government was liberating different towns around Damascus and Aleppo and other cities, they cut deals with these groups that if they went to Idlib, they would be given free passage. This, I believe, allowed Assad to take urban centers with, as, I guess, not as little civilian casualties as possible, but at the very least, it wasn't, just carpet bombing an area until the last terrorist is dead. It is important to note that the people, a lot of the Syrian opposition, especially the strongest fighters, were either al-Nusra, which is the Al-Qaeda affiliate group in Syria, or the Islamic State, which is, the big bad jihadist group that everybody hates. And so, when they controlled territory around the capital city of Syria, Damascus, they were firing mortar rounds and fires into the city all the time. And so, a war was on. Assad killed a lot of civilians in that process, but at the same time, ended up shipping a lot of terrorists to the Idlib province, again, instead of killing them all. At one point, the American policy against the Islamic State was, to isolate them and then destroy them all. Mattis put this out, and it led to the absolute destruction of a lot of cities in Iraq and Syria. And since, the Syrians live there, I guess they didn't want to destroy all the cities and kill all the civilians. Those militants are continuing to attack Syrian territory. Recently, they attacked a Syrian refinery. This is probably something that's just going to hurt the Syrian people as they try to rebuild their country. And it made sense why the Syrian government is pushing into the Idlib province of Syria and trying to liberate the rest of that area, which is mostly held by al-Nusra. Now, there's been various ceasefires that have gone on over the past couple of years in this area where humanitarian corridors have been opened and there's been negotiations with Turkey. One of the problems is that Turkey can't get all the jihadist groups that they are representing in their side of the negotiations to kind of comply with the different ceasefire deals they're reaching, and they continue to occupy territory that overlooks major Syrian highways, preventing commerce from returning to Syria. And so with that, and then the attacks from the rebel groups, it seems now that Assad is just moving in and taking large chunks of Idlib and moved to a key city south of the main capital city of Idlib, which is Idlib City. All right, going on to Iraq. The Pentagon now says that 34 soldiers have suffered, they say, brain injuries, so I guess this sounds more serious than as they kind of initially said concussion symptoms from this attack. Trump described it as headaches, and that got a little bit more media attention than a lot of foreign policy that I'm talking about today has. But even that hasn't generally gotten the same condemnation. I guess they can only hate Trump so much, and they're spending on CraneGate right now. Protesters assembled in Iraq over the weekend. Tens of thousands were there. Some people estimate hundreds of thousands of protesters took to the streets to demand Americans leave their country. With the situation, the Iraqi parliament has told the Americans to leave. The Iraqi people are telling the Americans to leave. We're an occupying force now, and what the U.S. is doing there is illegal. And, watching all this impeachment coverage all day, it makes me really annoyed that the Democrats won't look at the occupation of Iraq now and say, okay, in Syria as well, and say, this is an abuse of power by Trump, and this is something we can impeach him for. Daniel Davis has a great article out today at the National Interest, and I want to bring that up now because of the next couple of stories I'm going to talk about. And what Daniel Davis explains is that American soldiers are in harm's way, and this goes for American personnel of, all representatives or branches of the U.S. government. And that means it's the duty of the, President of the United States to protect them and remove them from Iraq. And so I want to say that because that's the solution to the problems we have in Iraq now, where the U.S. Embassy was apparently, or at least the grounds of the embassy, were hit with 3 rockets. One of them actually damaged the dining hall and injured at least one person. This is concerning because protesters breaking into the embassy in Iraq were apparently enough to sway Trump towards killing Soleimani, and has been a big excuse used by members of the Trump administration as, to needing to take out Soleimani. That, how could the U.S. respond now that rockets are actually hitting the embassy? Several protesters are dying in Iraq as they take to the streets. 5 over the weekend, and then at least 2 more this week. At least some of them seem to have been killed by live fire, others hit by tear gas canister. The UN has expressed some concern about what's happening in Iraq in the trials and convictions of former Islamic State fighters. This is something that I've been concerned about and talking about on the show for some time, that it seems like pretty much any Sunni who was definitely a male, but even, women that were associated with Islamic State fighters have been rounded up, some sentenced to death or given long draconian, sentences. One young man apparently sold some food to the Islamic State. Now, there's horror stories that I had read, and I don't know, how true they are, but I'm sure the Iraqi people heard them too. And ISIS was cruel enough for this to be believable, that, people who didn't sell or give the Islamic State what they wanted meant horrible, horrible ends. And so it's very possible that this kid, sold some vegetables to the Islamic State because he thought if he said no, they would shoot him and take the vegetables anyways. One pharmacist provided medical care to a wounded Islamic State fighter. Not that he was a member of the Islamic State, but, felt some kind of duty as some kind of medical professional to provide medical care to a man needed. He was sentenced to life in prison. That young man I was talking about before was sentenced to 15 years. And so it doesn't seem like justice is being handed out at all of these Iraqi courts. All right, I'll wrap up today, I guess, with some news on Israel. Recently, Prime Minister Netanyahu withdrew his bid to Parliament to seek immunity for corruption charges he is facing. I believe this came after a couple meetings between the U.S. and Gantz, and who's Netanyahu's main political rival in the upcoming election, and the U.S. and Netanyahu. I'm not sure if him meeting with the U.S. is involved in any way. And it also came just before the deal of the century was announced by Trump. So, maybe he thought this was a political gain. I'm not quite sure how, and so I'm not going to have much analysis on that, on how announcing the deal of the century plays out in the Israeli election and what's going on there. But I do think those are important developments that Netanyahu withdrew his corruption bid. He has been formally charged. And there were meetings between the U.S. And U.S. officials and both Netanyahu and his main political rival, but it does seem like Netanyahu got quite a bit more of the spotlight. The deal of the century is 80 pages and was just released earlier today, so no, I haven't read it all. Mostly what I've done at this point is just read some takes and reporting on it. Apparently, it calls for a separate Palestinian state that has East Jerusalem as a capital. I think there's a lot of problems with East Jerusalem, just how much of it has been taken already by Israeli settlements. What's left is not the best conditioned pieces of land, certainly not something that's going to a great international capital. And I would guess it's very questionable whether the Palestinians even really want to have their capital city there. Apparently, this Palestinian state would get $50 billion in aid or assistance from different Arab countries, and it would go to Egypt, Jordan, and Palestine. So who knows how much is actually going to Palestine. But it will allow for the building of roads, bridges, and tunnels, I guess, to connect the chunks of the West Bank that have been broken off already by Israeli settlements. We've already had Netanyahu talk about annexing the entire Jordan Valley if he's reelected. So it's possible that the actual state that Palestine would get is going to be quite small and fractured by Israeli settlements. The deal calls for Israel not to build settlements for 4 years. Israel's already been talking about improving new settlements even up until very recently. So my guess is that they just continue to build settlements. Overall, I don't think the deal of the century is going to turn into anything. The Palestinians have rejected it, and the Iranians have laughed at it, and not that they have full say of or really all that much influence in Palestine. But that's just to say, as a kind of an international actor that understands the position of the Palestinians, they know the Palestinians aren't going to accept this. So I don't see it turning into anything. Unfortunately, I guess the spin on this is going to be that, oh, look at the Palestinians being offered another good deal and turning it down. It's just too bad that they won't take any of Israel's generous offers, and I guess they have to continue to live under occupation for that reason. Meanwhile, Israel is just going to continue to, steal the land and expand the settlements and take more and more and more and force more Palestinians out, destroy more homes in Gaza and kill more people. And, that's really the thing. That the deal of the century is a nice title and everything, but if you really want to sum up kind of what's happened between Israel and Palestine, it's the steal of the century, and that Israel has gotten away with stealing so much of the West Bank now, and the destruction of Gaza and forcing out so many of the Palestinians, that it is a really incredible thing that happened, and strategically how it's worked out, and how that they been able to play this post World War II with all the Geneva Conventions and world law and everything like that. Israel's just constantly been allowed to expand their borders, take more and more Palestinian territory, essentially turn now into an apartheid state where 50% of the people who don't live under under Israeli control and Israeli occupation don't have the right to vote in election. Millions of the people, many of them refugees, are living in Gaza, which is essentially an open-air prison blockaded on all sides. They can't fish more than a couple miles off their coast. They can't exit through Israel, and often even the border with Egypt is blocked. So the deal of the century, I don't imagine playing out. It will probably be some news in the days to come. And again, look for the spin that, look, the Palestinians won't even negotiate because they won't take a deal that, they say as a slap in the face. All right, everybody, that's the show. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to share it. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, the Libertarian Institute at KYAAALE on Twitter, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus.